The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So yesterday, Donald Trump went on this wild, totally unhinged Twitter rant, which Ben Dixon told you about. I was traveling down to New Orleans yesterday for Netroots Nation. I'm here in New Orleans, and I'll be telling you about some of what's going on here as well. And we're now learning a little bit about what triggered the Twitter frenzy, which included calling for Attorney General Jeff Sessions to just end the Robert Mueller investigation into Trump Russia altogether. And we've heard before, collusion is not a crime. We've heard it time and again in the last year. And yet the actual crimes like obstruction of justice seem more and more likely by the day. And what we've now learned, according to ABC News, based on sources close to the White House, is that Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller, who of course is in charge of this Trump-Russia investigation, wants to ask President Donald Trump specifically about obstruction of justice. And this is big for a couple different reasons. It's not news that Mueller wants to talk to Trump. We've been talking about that for a while. It's not news that Trump's lawyers don't want Trump to talk to Mueller. We've been able to ascertain that because people like Rudy Giuliani have straight up said it. We don't want Trump to talk to Robert Mueller. And we've sort of been able to guess what Robert Mueller would want to talk about. But the big news now, which reportedly Trump learned about in the last 24 to 48 hours, triggering that Twitter frenzy, is that Robert Mueller, on the one hand, is willing to limit the scope of the questioning to a degree. And that's been a huge point of contention. Trump's lawyers don't want Trump going in there and being able to be asked about everything or close to everything. They want a predetermined list of subjects which they can prepare Donald Trump for, to the extent that the guy can prepare for anything. And one of the topics under discussion for those limitations is indeed obstruction of justice. So this is huge for a couple of different reasons. Number one, it's huge because it's been a little bit of radio silence for the last few weeks or month and a half about whether or not Trump and Mueller are actually going to talk. And this, of course, confirms that that conversation is still ongoing. But it also confirms that whether Trump committed crimes is a focus of the investigation. And we also now know that Trump knows this. Trump, for a very long time, has been insisting, I'm not under investigation. James Comey told me I'm not under investigation. Is Trump a target or a subject or a person of interest? What we now know, and you can apply whatever legal language you want to it, is that Robert Mueller wants to ask Trump about questions relating to the crime of obstruction of justice. And Trump, as you know from yesterday, again, because Ben Dixon told you this, went on this wild Twitter rant, which I won't repeat to you in total, but I do want to remind you about one particular tweet that was part of that, which is when Donald Trump tweeted, "This is a terrible situation, and Attorney General Jeff Sessions should stop this rigged witch hunt right now before it continues to stain our country any further. Bob Mueller is totally conflicted, and his 17 angry Democrats that are doing his dirty work are a disgrace to the United States." So first of all, the scale up of the smear campaign against Robert Mueller coincides with the progress of these negotiations around Trump being interviewed by Mueller. And bigger picture, we see these Trump Twitter rants, and it sometimes appears randomly timed, right? Like the 4 a.m. rant about who knows what. But we learn in example after example after example that what really is true is that they are real-time reactions to whatever happens to be angering Donald Trump at the time. And sometimes we don't find out about it until later. This is one case. Trump goes on this rant. It's not exactly clear why. We later learn this was happening almost in real time as he was told, Mueller wants to talk to you about obstruction of justice. Now, in terms of the strategy, because it might seem dumb or ignorant or ill-informed, ill-advised to learn that a special prosecutor wants to ask you about obstruction of justice, and then you go on Twitter and you do what is arguably trying to obstruct that justice, which is directing your attorney general to end the investigation into obstruction of justice. Is Trump dumb, Or is he so, I guess narcissistic is the word, that when he finds out Mueller wants to talk about obstruction of justice, he goes on Twitter and tries to obstruct that investigation by tweeting that it should end? I don't know the answer. And I'm curious whether the committed Trumpist is now ready to say, I'm not even asking for a big concession, but is the committed Trumpist ready to say, okay, Mueller is looking into whether Trump committed crimes. It's not proof that Trump did anything wrong. It's only an indication that Mueller is looking at possible criminal action by Donald Trump, at the minimum obstruction of justice. And then, of course, there's questions of witness tampering, money laundering, financial crimes, and all of this other stuff. And forget about now knowing that Mueller wants to explore obstruction. Is this how an innocent person acts, right? Forget about the question of, will we ultimately determine that crimes were committed? Can a president be indicted? Those are separate questions. Is this how an innocent person acts? Mueller still wants to talk, including about obstruction, and Trump says, end the entire thing right now. The fear is obvious. The panic is very transparent, and my hope is that soon we'll have a final determination about, is the sit down going to take place? What limitations are being placed on Robert Mueller or his investigators, who maybe would be as likely to be speaking to Donald Trump? I'm hoping that we get confirmation about this really soon, because it's abundantly clear that you've got to talk to Trump now. Trump is connected enough to this that even though Trump's lawyers for months have been trying to prevent this sit down between Mueller's team and Donald Trump, Mueller's not going away. We don't yet have reason to believe a subpoena has been issued, but that's always been in the background. This is clearly an investigation that can't be satisfied in a satisfactory way unless Donald Trump is personally interviewed. And that is increasingly clear. And hopefully we'll have news soon about if and when that conversation is going to take place. Some of you may have noticed that the David Pakman Show launched on Spotify a little while ago. I think we've been on Spotify for several months, and it's been really good for us. Not every show can just get on Spotify. Anybody can create a podcast feed and submit it to iTunes. And if it meets the technical requirements that iTunes puts in place, you're now on iTunes. Spotify is a little more restrictive, and we were part of an invitation of podcasts, a group of podcasts that was invited to be on Spotify, and getting on there has been really big for us. We have a significant podcast listenership on Spotify, in addition to the other platforms we're on, like iTunes and iHeartRadio and Stitcher and some of the other ones. Spotify has now made the decision to delete several episodes of Alex Jones's podcast, Alex Jones's conspiracy podcast. I don't know if it's the exact same content that goes on Alex Jones' InfoWars website or his YouTube channel, but there's certainly a lot of overlap in what he puts out in audio form and what goes out in video form. Part of those, some of those episodes have been deleted by Spotify, and this is part of like a growing backlash against them. And when I say backlash, I don't mean like a concerted political effort against Alex Jones. I just mean that a number of different social media and content distribution platforms have decided that some of Alex Jones' content violates their terms of service. Facebook suspended Alex Jones' personal page and removed some of his videos. YouTube removed 4 videos. And Spotify now has pulled some episodes of Alex Jones' content from their platform. And the reasoning has been pretty similar in all of these cases. And it's been some version of, these episodes violate our guidelines, our terms of service in terms of the content that exists there. And of course, Alex Jones' fan base immediately started saying, and some on the right started saying, this is an effort to censor right-wing views. These are violations of free speech, and really going off the deep end with this stuff. The bottom line here is, I hate to break it to you, but this really isn't very controversial. We might not like it. We might disagree with these policies, but YouTube has terms of service guidelines. The David Pakman Show has had videos demonetized. We've had videos flagged as age restricted that I didn't necessarily agree should be age restricted, which limits the amount of money you can make on them. We've had videos removed altogether, although not for content, but because of, for example, alleged copyright infringement. It's not a political attack on the David Pakman Show. It's part of this sort of anti controversy bias that YouTube has because of its advertiser relationships. Facebook, some of our content has been flagged on Facebook because we had B-roll, right? That video that sometimes plays while I'm describing the story to you that was allegedly too graphic or exceeded, sort of went over the line that Facebook has set for its community. I don't like it. It's just not a huge deal. And I wish the policy were different. I wish I could always monetize every single video and get, 100% of the possible revenue out of the content we produce as opposed to some fraction short of 100%. But the framing of this entire thing as an anti-Alex Jones conspiracy is just totally without evidence. And the problem with Jones is he builds up a narrative of the globalists are controlling the media and they're hiding the truth and they want to censor me or him, as Alex Jones would say. Then a few of his episodes get removed, and now that becomes evidence supposedly supporting that conspiracy theory. It's sort of like if I said car companies set up brakes to need to be replaced all the time so that you have to spend money. Imagine that I say that every single day on the show. Car companies are running a scam that is brake pads. They're running a scam. And after 18 months, my brake pads now have actually worn out, and I finally have to change them. And I say, look, this is proof that my conspiracy theory is accurate. I've been saying this for 18 months. Is it really, or is it just that after 18 months, at some point, you got to replace your brake pads? And Spotify and YouTube and Facebook have no obligation to host Alex Jones content. If he wants to run his own servers, he can put whatever the hell he wants on those servers, and there won't be anybody there who could even possibly censor him, assuming the content isn't illegal. But that would be him saying, well, I want to forego the audience that YouTube brings or the audience that Facebook brings and put the content on my own server. The real concern here is not a few episodes getting removed. It's that Alex Jones and Trump and others are all participating in what I call the degradation of political discourse. The types of conversations, and this is why I've talked about, we will sometimes in a tongue-in-cheek way use the word cuck, but it's really to kind of make fun of the people that use it. And I've said I don't know if that's a good idea, because even using the term sarcastically suggests that it might even be a valid term in political discourse. Jones and Trump and these others have, either under the name of telling it like it is or telling a truth that nobody else is willing to or whatever, it fuels this reduction of politics to bottom-feeding sort of lowest common denominator debate and conspiracy theories and not having to defend what you say with any kind of facts. That's what's really dangerous. And the entire sort of milieu that considers this even remotely reasonable debate, what Alex Jones does, the Comet ping pong thing, which I guess he's backed off of now at this point, whether you believe 8 of 10 facts or 6 of 10 assertions or whatever about Comet ping pong, the idea that that entire story even qualifies as a legitimate debate is part of the problem that needs to be addressed. And I actually don't know how. So if I'm wrong, if the removal of a few episodes of Alex Jones' podcast from Spotify is actually the problem that the right says it is, let me know and explain to me specifically why. I'm on Twitter at dpakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. We'll take a quick break, coming to you from New Orleans, Louisiana, where it is extraordinarily hot and humid. We've got a great program planned for you today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Big thanks to today's new member of the day, Thomas Morris Jr. Thomas, thank you for signing up at www.joinpakman.com. It's not just something I say, we really are supported by viewers and listeners through the membership program. And somebody who's been supporting us for almost 6 years is David Makielski. David Makielski is our long-term sustaining member of the day. Thomas, David, thanks to both of you. You can join them at www.joinpakman.com. 40% off coupon code is available. That code is VOTESOON18. And if you want a simpler, quicker, cheaper way to support the David Pakman Show. You can pledge as little as just $1 a month, 12 bucks for the year at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. You can still get a lot of the same benefits that members get starting at the $5 a month level. Let's talk about what's going on the David Pakman Show subreddit. We do have a discussion forum. It doesn't live on our own website, but it's over on Reddit at www.davidpakman.com/Reddit. That is REDDIT. Nearly 7,000 of our viewers and listeners regularly participating in non-trolling, respectful, friendly, mostly political discussion and debate. A few interesting threads I noticed this morning when checking out the David Pakman Show subreddit. Is the 3D blueprints for guns a First Amendment or Second Amendment issue? This is an interesting question. The viewer says, from what I understand, I read about some case where some programmer wrote a book about making strong security algorithms, and the court sided with him in releasing the book to bypass the U.S. export laws regarding weapons export. He is only releasing the blueprints for the guns, and there is already federal law that prohibits the use of fully plastic guns. What are your thoughts? Yeah, this is interesting because on the one hand, you have the legality of the gun itself, and separate from that is effectively speech, right, or text that would tell you or have instructions for how to print that gun. So are 3D printed guns a First Amendment or Second Amendment issue? From what I've read, it's not really a First Amendment issue right now, and I've referenced this case about a bomb-making guide from the 60s or 70s. I think that it is actually more of a Second Amendment issue, but there's a lot going on related to this. We talked about it on a bonus show. Ben Dixon talked about it on yesterday's program, filling in for me. We will see whether the 3D printed guns evolves to be more of a First or Second Amendment issue. Also from the David Pakman Show subreddit, don't worry too much about the 3D printed guns. To be non-detectable, you would have to have plastic ammunition also, and the thing would likely blow up in your face. You know, this is sort of a false dichotomy because you don't only have plastic or metal ammunition. And part of the issue is that there are 3D printers that use other composite materials, which may not trigger a metal detector, but might be more effective than straight up plastic ammunition. So that may be something that makes it less of a concern today, but even a year out, that could be very different. And I don't think it's really material to the debate around the legality. Also from the David Pakman Show subreddit, should totalitarianism be used to describe Trump? In my opinion, this blurs the discussion. Totalitarianism is something different than plain authoritarianism. At least in my opinion, it is about an ideology that wants to take subject an entire state and society to its apocalyptic and violent ideology. You should be very careful with analogies with totalitarianism. I completely agree. I believe that we want to be accurate when we talk about political ideology. And this is why if we're talking about socialism, great. But if we're talking about social democracy, then we should use the term social democracy unless we actually agree that the definitions of these terms have changed. Along the same lines, Donald Trump has authoritarian tendencies. He seems to be quite taken by authoritarian dictators in other countries. But the United States is not currently totalitarian. Would it become that if Donald Trump was allowed to push his authoritarianism to its full conclusion, whatever it is he has in mind? Yeah, maybe. But I agree that totalitarianism right now is simply not the right term for what was happening in the United States. Lastly, from the David Pakman Show subreddit, is David Sacha Baron Cohen? I don't even know what this means. I don't know where this came from. We did a few stories related to Sacha Baron Cohen's new Showtime program, Who is America? I don't think I look like the guy. I'm certainly not British, and I don't know exactly what people mean, but we are both Jewish. I don't know if that's what people are pointing at. Somebody can explain that one to me. I'd love to hear and learn more about it. Join the discussion at davidpakman.com/REDDIT. Okay, as some of you remember, I got in trouble years ago for making a comment about breastfeeding on an airplane when there was a kid that looked 5 or 6 years old who was being breastfed. And I said, I think the kid's too old to be breastfeeding. And the lactivists were furious with me. The Leaky Boob, another group, was absolutely furious with me and sent me articles saying breastfeeding is okay all the way up to 7 or 8 years old. They didn't convince me, but regardless of that, I actually am very big on affirming the ability for women to breastfeed in public in any place where they can legally be, unfettered and unimpeded. And the big news is that breastfeeding has now been legally affirmed in all 50 states. And people might hear that and say, wait a second, was breastfeeding illegal in some states? Well, it wasn't illegal, but it was not legally protected in all places where women are allowed to be. Utah and Idaho have now legally affirmed breastfeeding, meaning it is now abundantly clear, legally speaking at least, that in 50 states, women can breastfeed in any place where they are legally allowed to be. This is actually still controversial in some parts of the United States. How dare women feed children in front of other humans? Babies clearly must be fed in private for some reason I can't really understand. In Utah, some of the Republican opposition feels that breastfeeding is too in your face if done in a public place. Idaho sort of had an easier time this time around, but in the past has had trouble with male legislators who were worried that women would whip it out and do it anywhere. That's a direct quote from some of the prior debate in Idaho about public breastfeeding. I genuinely don't get why this is even something we're still talking about. I mean, not only does this make sense because we shouldn't be shaming women, it also makes sense because the stigma around breastfeeding, by pushing women into bathrooms, makes it so that more women don't necessarily breastfeed, when it's been found that, assuming that there aren't any health risks or particular medical situations, breastfeeding is the best option for the early nutrition of babies. So there's basically two types of breastfeeding laws. Some states say specifically any place women can legally be, they're allowed to breastfeed. In other states, the law sort of affirms or clarifies that female breasts exposed for breastfeeding purposes are exempt from public indecency statutes, right? There are some places where female breasts being exposed would violate public indecency statutes. And the way that breastfeeding is legally affirmed in those states is that it says that if you're breastfeeding and your breasts are out, you're not liable to be charged under public indecency statutes. So more than illegal, what happens here is that we can say we are legally protecting breastfeeding in all 50 states. I've actually seen some pretty big kerfuffles start because of a woman breastfeeding. And I know that people who live in relatively progressive and I guess we would say more enlightened parts of the United States would be shocked to hear this, but I've seen on airplanes, and I'm not even talking about the incident I referred to earlier. I've seen controversy on airplanes about women breastfeeding. I've seen it in restaurants. I saw it once in a government building and also in a hotel lobby. People just get upset and disgusted, and they start kind of going out of their way to look disgusted about what they're seeing. And one I read about is anger about breastfeeding at swimming pools where it says no food allowed. This is one of the dumbest oppositions to public breastfeeding that I've actually seen, and it's more common than you might imagine. No food allowed at swimming pools is because of some guy with popcorn or candy bars where you don't want the wrappers or kernels of popcorn in the pool. Women nursing their kids is not why those rules exist. And even if you don't nurse, I hate to break it to you, but the food is still in the pool area, right? The milk is still there. It's not the eating that you're not supposed to do. It's the having of the food, and that doesn't change. And forget about the spirit of the rule. It's just not why these rules forget about the letter of the rule, rather. The spirit of those rules is not about a woman feeding her kid. It's the dude with donuts and the melting chocolate bar that caused those rules to be in place. And I just think that this is such a stupid debate to be having. And it also, there's a sort of sidebar debate that correlates with this a little bit, which is that there are lots of places where the topless laws are not gendered. In other words, both men and women are allowed to be topless. Try walking by as a woman topless and see how quickly things will escalate with the so-called moral majority folks. But if you are against public breastfeeding, please email me. I want to hear from you because I just don't get it. What is it exactly that you're opposed to? Discuss this or any other stories from today's show on the David Pakman Show subreddit at davidpakman.com/REDDIT. We will take a quick break. I am in New Orleans, Louisiana at Netroots Nation, and much more about what's going on here coming up later.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by John Zmirak, who's the senior editor of The Stream and author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Immigration. John, it's great to talk to you. You know, anytime I hear politically incorrect, I immediately want to know, what would it be that, were it not for political correctness, we could have as a conversation, or sort of what are we sort of getting at? So when it comes to immigration, what do you feel that political correctness is restricting in terms of a conversation?
I think political correctness is putting a fake moral value on the immigration debate. It's trying to pretend that it's about race, that it's about ethnicity, that there's something uniquely horrible about Americans wanting to control the borders to their country, when the same people accept perfectly well that the Congolese and the Koreans and the Chinese and the people in Santo Domingo have a right to determine immigration based on their national interests. Somehow when America or Europe tries to do it, it's the equivalent of restarting the Atlantic slave trade. And that's just nonsense.
And who has said that enforcing or having immigration laws is like the slave trade?
Well, the protesters who are demanding that we shut down ICE. The candidates for Attorney General in New York and for Governor of New York have called for closing down ICE. I think Cynthia Nixon called it a terrorist organization. This is an organization that deports drug smugglers and human traffickers, members of groups like MS-13. It's our only interior enforcement of our immigration laws.
But I'm confused about one thing, just not to lose, because I want to understand. I'm making every effort to understand exactly what you mean. When you said, first you said that there are people who have equated having immigration laws to the slave trade, but then you just gave an example of someone who wants to shut down ICE.
Okay. The Catholic bishop of Brownsville, Texas, I believe, equated deporting immigrants with abortion. He says the same kind of thing. Okay, so there's a specific for you. Okay,
and is that part of the political correctness that prevents us from having the conversation you want to have? That's the part I kind of am super interested in, because speech and political correctness are topics I delve into quite a bit. You don't feel that we're able to just say, hey, it's okay for countries to have borders and immigration rules because of political correctness?
Because the anti-whiteness narrative, you see people talking about whiteness as if it were a disease. You'd see people trying to banish authors from the curricula of English departments because they happen to be white males. You see a kind of reverse bias that's just as bad as any other form of bias. And so implicitly, the only countries whose right to control their borders is being questioned are Western countries, European countries, and the United States. Nobody is questioning Japan's very restrictive immigration policies. Nobody is questioning China's immigration policies. They won't let North Koreans in. No one's questioning those. And no one is admitting that the United States, as a sovereign country, has an absolute right to take or reject immigrants based exclusively on its national interest.
Sure. I think that maybe there's a couple of issues in there that we could disaggregate. I mean, I guess, first of all, if you're an American immigration activist, whatever your views are, and they might coincide with John Zmirak's or they might not, wouldn't it be logical that you would be focused on American immigration rather than Japanese or Chinese? Like, that seems kind of obvious. And I guess as a counterexample, if all of a sudden the Japanese started weighing in on American immigration law, wouldn't you just say, hey, America needs to decide these are Japanese people?
Oh, but Mexico constantly weighs in on our immigration policies. Mexico is constantly talking about it. In fact, Obrador, the new president of Mexico, has said that every Mexican has the right to relocate to the United States if he wants to.
Sure, but that has nothing to do with American law. I mean,
the Mexican government allows those people to vote in Mexican elections even though they live here. Immigration activists in the United States cooperate with people from the Mexican government. They sponsor speakers at their events. Meanwhile, Mexico, well within its purview, maintains quite a strict southern border with Central America. I'm glad they are no longer as strict as they used to be.
Okay.
They used to shoot illegal immigrants on sight when they tried to enter Mexico. I thank God they've stopped that inhumane policy. But the fact is that you've got American citizens waving Mexican flags, talking about how wonderful Mexico is or whatever their other country of origin is, and demanding as a right of justice that more people be able to come into this country from those countries. Meanwhile, those countries don't maintain open borders, as they should not, because it does not benefit any country to have open borders. Ever.
I guess I'm just not sure. So what's the problem? These are people in the U.S. Hold on a second, John. Let me see if I can frame the question. So you're saying there's a problem with political correctness where we can't really have the conversation you think we need to have. Hold on. If I can even just frame the question.
My focus is not on political correctness in the book. They have a series of books called The Politically Incorrect Guide. They asked me to write the one on immigration.
Okay.
I have maybe 500 words in the entire book on that. And if that's what you want to talk about, I think we are wasting our time.
All right, let's not waste it. Let's get into some of the meat of it if I can.
I don't think this is going anywhere. Thank you.
John, if we could get to the next topic, I would be glad to talk about the specifics. It just seemed like you had, I think he just cut me off. Okay, he did. Wow. That was very weird. That I don't even know what to say about that. Man, that guy was angry. Okay. I mean, I was hoping to talk to him. You know, he makes claims about the economic impact of immigration, and which, of course, I disagree with him on. I wanted to talk about immigrant crime, which, of course, we know immigrants are less likely to commit crime than domestic-born people, and it sort of makes sense, as we've talked about, because if you're here illegally, you want to stay off the radar of law enforcement. But he's a very angry guy, and you know the backstory on that interview. Well, it seems like I have some time to talk about this. The backstory on that interview is that a lot of people in the audience said, hey, David, it would be great to do more issue-oriented debates with people you disagree with, like not just I'm a white nationalist and we kind of like give a white nationalist rope to hang themselves, but really getting into issues. So like earlier this week, I did one with Peter Coffin where we disagreed about socialism versus social democracy. And we had that conversation. This was pitched to us as a guy who really wanted to, his publicist says he wants to appear on shows. I said, great, let's talk about immigration. And we spent a bunch of time doing prep, and we had plenty of time to discuss. And it seemed like he didn't like the line of questioning. And if I acted inappropriately, I want to hear from the audience about it. But that was extraordinarily unusual. And I think it's only happened 5 times or so, something like that. So, okay, well, I guess we're not going to get too far. I think people probably started to understand the direction he was going in, which was sort of internally contradictory points of views about whose opinion is valid and invalid about their country's immigration and other countries. But that's too bad. I was looking forward to that conversation, and John clearly was not ready to have it. And, you know, producer Pat warned me, based on the research he had done, that he doesn't always engage in dialogue per se. There's a lot of sort of echo chamber stuff with John, and I don't know how much he knew about the David Pakman Show, but that I think we chalk that up as a loss in the battle of ideas. I really do. Send me your thoughts, and we will continue to actually try to have productive dialogue with people whose views differ from mine.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
At this point, if you're serious about economic issues, you've probably developed sort of a more nuanced sense of debt and deficit. And oftentimes we hear from the right very general and almost meaningless in how vague they are statements or talking points like the deficit is bad, debt is bad, we need to cut in order to improve the economy, cut spending, of course. They will always say when a Democrat raises the deficit that this is what Democrats do. And they will often campaign on, we lower the deficit and we will start reducing the debt even by creating a surplus, which of course never actually seems to end up happening. And there's 4 or 5 layers of deception there. First of all, Republican George W. Bush was one of the biggest deficit exploding presidents. So first and foremost is the question, factually, do Democrats increase the deficit, whereas Republicans lower it? And at least by counterexample, we know that that's not always true. Bill Clinton actually ran a surplus. George W. Bush blew up the deficit. Of course, that you can say, well, Clinton had the benefit of the dot-com boom, and George W. Bush had the detriment of the Iraq War and 9/11 and so on and so forth. But at least the big picture of it is that it's not true to say Democrats blow up the deficit and Republicans reduce it. But then secondly, and this is what we've been talking about more and more on the program, and we've even done some interviews about it with Stephanie Kelton and Pavlina Cherneva and others. More importantly, I would say, the entire paradigm that the deficit is objectively bad has become a political football. And I would agree as a sort of general principle that just increasing the deficit and accruing more debt is not a good thing in kind of a vacuum, right? But going into debt for economically stimulative programs or reasons like food stamps, which have a very, very high economic multiplier, healthcare for all as another example, which we don't know about for sure, but has been speculated about in a number of studies, that's much better, or we could say much less bad, than going into debt to give rich people tax cuts, which will mostly be just put in bank accounts. But even taken at its merits, we also now are able to evaluate the promises that have been made by Donald Trump when it comes to so-called fiscal conservatism and debt and the deficit. So, for example, in fiscal year 2019, which starts in October, the White House says we will run a $1.1 trillion deficit. The number of dollars of the deficit is sometimes less relevant than how big is the deficit relative to the GDP, because if your country's growing in raw dollars, it might also be anticipated that the deficit grows. That doesn't necessarily tell us whether it's getting bigger or smaller as a portion of the economy. We are going to see a bigger than 5% deficit as a portion of the GDP for fiscal year 2019 under Trump, okay, 5%. Compare that to fiscal year 2016, for example. The deficit was only about 3% of GDP. In fiscal year 2017, the deficit was about 3.5% of GDP. And it has gone up twice now under Donald Trump. Trump's first full year as president, we saw the deficit as a percentage of GDP climb to 4.2%. And then again in 2019, now it's looking like it's going to be 5% of GDP. So there's a bunch of like underlying claims here that we need to explore. First of all, Donald Trump told us that the tax cuts on the rich and on corporations were going to grow the economy so much that there would be more tax revenue brought in, particularly corporate tax cuts, corporate tax revenues, that is. The opposite seems to be true so far. Tax revenue to the government from corporate taxes has been and continues to fall. So then you say, okay, well, fine, businesses are paying less in taxes, but they're using that tax cut that Donald Trump gave them to pay people more, to give raises, and to hire people, right? Well, no, that's wrong. That's also not happening. As we've separately reported from other data, most of the tax cuts that corporations have received are going to paying out executive bonuses, paying out dividends to shareholders, and buying back their own company stock, which has the effect of driving up the price, which of course disproportionately benefits the shareholders who are overwhelmingly wealthy, as well as the executives. So what we get to in the end is that the amount of the deficit in and of itself isn't actually the problem. It never really was. And maybe the right knows this, or maybe they're only hypocrites. I think that they're both a combination of hypocrites and ignorant, because we know that they only care about the deficit when a Democrat is president. And all of a sudden, when you have George W. Bush, it's excuses for why the deficit went up, or just straight up lies saying the deficit didn't go up. But more importantly to me, the ways in which Republicans like Trump raise the deficit are bad for the economy. Like, for example, tax cuts for the rich and tax cuts for corporations. And this, to me, is actually the bigger point and the bigger conversation I think we have to make. Just deficit bad, deficit good, debt bad, debt good. That's not actually the most important conversation to have right now, because we have a more nuanced understanding that debt can be good or bad. The deficit can be a tool used to generate real economic growth with a high economic multiplier, or it can be a way to let rich people sock away more money in their bank accounts. What we're learning is that if we say, hey, you know what, tax cuts for less wealthy people, or healthcare for all, or food stamps, or educational stimulus, we can go into debt to do those things, but because of the high economic multiplier, we get more back later on. Spending money now on education might increase the deficit. It might not, right? But it might increase the deficit. But later, because we know more educated people commit less crime, and we know that they end up generating more revenue because they earn more money in the long run because they're more educated, it's actually a net decrease on deficit. That is a much more useful way to go into debt than just tax cuts for the rich. And then here's the last thing that I think when it comes to Trump's claims, it's just not being accounted for. When you looked at, and this is, it starts to get a little wonky, but I think this is important. So I'll do my best to explain it clearly. When we saw the analyses done of the 10-year impact of Donald Trump's tax reform, and that's the way these are done. What's the impact over 10 years? Because different provisions take a while to be put into effect, and we don't just say what will happen next year. What will happen over 10 years? The calculations were based on an economy that was going to continue doing really well for those 10 years. And it's true that the tax cuts for the rich are cutting government revenue, but if the economy does grow, some of that is going to come back, not enough to make up for the tax cuts for the rich. But at some point, there's going to be a downturn in the economy, right? And as you know, I don't pretend to know exactly when it's going to be. There's a good chance in the next 10 years, there's going to be a downturn in the economy. How significant it is, whether it affects the stock market and housing and employment, what areas, we don't yet know. But if that happens, forget about $1 trillion deficit under Donald Trump. You are going to have the deficit increasing elements of his tax plan, and some of that economic growth, some of which is real, just not nearly as much as Trump promises, that's going to disappear. And there are reports talking about $2 or even $3 trillion deficits. Maybe by then a Democrat will be in the White House and Republicans can blame them. But it's really important to understand 3, 4, or even 5 layers on which the deception and the bad policy and the just poor economics operate on. Don't fall for it, because this stuff really will rot your mind. That's when it comes to debt and deficit. And then next, I want to talk about the GDP-related lies that are being told. So let's start there. I've talked about how there are politician lies and liar lies, and then there are kind of in-betweens, right? So an example of a politician lie would be under Obama saying that a particular type of GDP is growing less slowly than some other kind, and it's sort of like, it might be true to the letter, but it really misrepresents the spirit of what we're measuring, right? This would be like a politician lie, okay? It's not strictly speaking demonstrably false, but it's a distortion of what we usually mean when we talk about that particular issue. Trump has made it a common aspect, a common tenet
of his administration to tell what we call liar lies, just straight up demonstrable lies. My inauguration crowd was the biggest ever, for example, or I never made a comment about X when we have tweets and video of him making a comment about X. And then there's a lot of in-betweens that relate to economic data, unemployment numbers, debt, deficit. All of these pieces of data are really easy to mess with, so that you're maybe not lying by the letter, but you're definitely being deceptive in spirit. And on the issue of GDP, gross domestic product, the Trump team is now telling straight up, unmitigated, total lies about what's going on. So let's set this up. First of all, what is GDP? GDP is one measure of an economy's growth or contraction. GDP stands for gross domestic product. It is calculated as the total value of goods produced and services provided in a country during 1 year. How it's calculated, how imports and exports impact it, it's not really relevant for our conversation today, which is just about lies and deception. Over the weekend, Donald Trump claimed 4.1% second quarter GDP growth. Okay, that's where we'll start. He had a whole event. It was all meant to talk about 4.1% GDP growth. And Trump said a lot of other crazy stuff during this event. So let's take a look at the video clip.
Everywhere we look, we are seeing the effects of the American economic miracle. We have added 3.7 million new jobs since the election. A number that is unthinkable if you go back to the campaign. Nobody would have said it. Nobody would have even, in an optimistic way, projected it. We are in the midst of the longest positive job growth streak in history.
So almost everything that Donald Trump said there is simply not true, but I want to focus in a little bit on the GDP numbers. This GDP number has become sort of the central point of a ton of lies for the last 5 or 6 days. So here's an example. Donald Trump Jr. on Twitter tweeted, "Incredible numbers. I remember when the experts laughed about breaking 3%. Just because Obama never broke 2% doesn't mean that someone with great policies can't. Let's keep this going." That's a straight up, unmitigated lie. Under President Barack Obama, GDP growth broke 2% 16 times. It broke 3% 8 times. It hit 4% 4 times. And it was actually 5% on one occasion. What Donald Trump Jr. is saying, what Donald Trump himself and his cronies are touting, that this is unheard of, nobody would have even thought about it. Well, maybe people weren't thinking about it because it wasn't that notable, because Obama did 5% once and 4% 4 times and so on and so forth. And as usual, a single quarter of 4.1%. You've got to think about, why is that happening? Donald Trump says 4.1% GDP growth is sustainable. Is it actually sustainable? Is it because the business environment is improving in some macro way that we had 4.1% GDP growth? Or is it because of underlying factors that are actually concerning? Let me give you an example. We know about these tariffs. The tariffs are ramping up. Many have been already enacted. More are coming. One possible explanation as to why GDP was up 4.1% in this particular quarter could be because manufacturers are stocking up on materials from other countries because of Donald Trump's trade war. And that on the backside of this, there's going to be a sharp downturn. That's a possibility, right? Of course, if the economy were really that strong, you might, in addition to GDP growth, see wage growth. But you're not seeing it. And in fact, that's a problem that's bigger than Donald Trump, but it continues to indicate that in many ways, the economy is not doing that well as maybe the stock market would suggest. So this isn't about me wanting to deny that 4.1% is a good GDP number on paper. This is to point out that, first and foremost, the idea that these are unheard of GDP growth numbers under Obama, that's a total straight up farcical lie. I mean, flat out, it's just a lie. But number two, just like I've described to you that the labor force could shrink because there's a bad economy, but the labor force could also shrink because people can afford to retire which implies a good economy, right? Just the number itself doesn't really tell you what's going on underlying the economy. And in that same way, a single quarter of higher GDP growth could be because of some negative indicators, and it could be because of some positive indicators as well. The problem is nobody understands. No one seems to care to understand. And Trump himself lacks the basic understanding of economics on this stuff. And we've talked about this on trade. Trump, knowing very little about trade, started talking about trade, unfair trade, and so on during the campaign. His supporters fell for it. And all of a sudden now Trump has basically free rein to make terrible decisions when it comes to trade, like the trade war. In the same way, Trump has been successful at touting GDP growth numbers in a total vacuum with no context or consideration for what's going on in the economy. And it works really, really well. And what I'm trying to do is to give you just a little bit more information about how we should understand some of that data. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. A lot of feedback from my interview earlier this week with former Trump foreign policy advisor Carter Page. Here is one voicemail that really represents what the consensus seemed to be about that interview. Take a listen to this.
Hey, David, in the dictionary, I looked up the word obfuscate, and there's a picture next to it of Carter Page. That's the only thing I learned from that interview. He was very indirect and dishonest, and he looks like a weasel in that photograph of his. All the Republicans look dishonest. Maybe we should make our decision about who to vote for based on whether they look dishonest or not. Have a good night.
Yeah. I don't know about voting for people based on their physical appearance, but that was the consensus about the Carter Page interview, which was that he seemed to be obfuscating. He seemed to be very, very slippery was a word that came up time and again. And yeah, I mean, when I just say to him, did you meet X person in Russia? And he takes 7 minutes and asks me about the Boston Celtics, that doesn't exactly inspire confidence that this guy is being super upfront. There's one other thing, which this is just a weird sidebar, but people noticed that he wasn't on video. We only had audio from Carter Page. There was this whole lead up to the interview where we explained we're a TV show. We do interviews via Skype video. And he said, I don't have Skype and I don't want to download Skype. I can't do it. We've got to do audio. I'm going to call in. He ended up calling in from a phone number associated with Skype, and we didn't call him out on it. I haven't even mentioned it to him, but it was extraordinarily odd, and it made me question whether he was even upfront with us in the lead up to the interview. You be the judge. We have a great bonus show coming up today. We're going to talk about some never-Trumpers who are considering supporting Democrats in the midterms and even potentially working for Democrats in the 2020 presidential campaign. We will talk about whether that makes sense for them, whether it's a good thing for Democrats, and much more. We will also talk about the possible first U.S. service member remains being returned to the United States by North Korea. And we will discuss whether this is the start of Kim Jong-un potentially keeping his word about those promises that he made. And then lastly, on the bonus show, another tax cut that will overwhelmingly, disproportionately, monumentally benefit the very rich, suggested or being considered by the Trump administration. This one is to capital gains taxes. And the way it would be achieved is by inflation indexing the cost basis for investments subject to the capital gain tax. If that sounds nuts to you, I will explain it to you in detail on the bonus show, which you can get access to by becoming a member at www.joinpakman.com or by becoming a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.